Hello, and everyone, and welcome. We're so happy that so many are joining us this evening for what we hope is a helpful conversation surrounding something we all use and many of us struggle to understand, social media. I am Cristina Peixoto, the President and CEO of Spalding for Children. Spalding was established with the belief that strong families are essential to promote the safety and the well-being of children. 53 years later, Spalding continues to hold true to the mission and core values of our founders. We continue to deliver service and develop products that are designed to equip families with the knowledge and the skills needed to give children the best chance to succeed in life. I will introduce you to our guest speakers in a minute, but first, I want to tell you a little bit about why we're having this conversation. All over the world, social media has become the lifeline for people to stay connected, access resources, and for support. In the United States, 70% of us are on social media an average of more than 2 hours a day. We know social media can be addictive and can impact the well-being of families, especially kids. Many young people use social media very well, but some are at the increased risk of exploitation, harassment, anxiety, and depression. Whether young people are impacted positively or negatively, social media continues to be an important factor affecting children's safety, stability, and the well-being of families. So to address our concerns, we reached out to some of our community partners, the Detroit PAL and the Life Church Auburn Hills. We found out that they too want to make social media a safer place for children and their families. So we put our heads together and reached out to some experts to create understanding social media tools and traps. We do have a great team of experts here tonight to talk about the impact of social media from the ethical, mental health, and civic engagement perspectives, and provide some practical advice and strategies. Before we start, I would like to thank our partners that helped put this webinar together. The Detroit PAL, the Life Church Auburn Hills, Melissa and Frank Bunker from Campbell Marketing. I also like to thank the Health Alliance Plan of Michigan for sponsoring tonight's event. Without our partners and sponsor, we would not be able to put this program together. Now, just a few housekeeping reminders. All participants are muted, but we hope to hear from you. So please ask questions throughout the webinar by selecting the Q&A feature. We do our best to address as many questions as we can throughout the conversation. The webinar is being recorded and will be shared with all registrants in the coming days. Now join me in welcoming our panelists. April Dinwoody, marketing and communication professional and a social media expert. Dr. Luana Marques, a clinical psychologist and an associate professor at the Harvard Medical School. Dr. Marques is also the president of the Anxiety and Depression Association of America. Robert Jamerson is the CEO of the Detroit PAL and an expert in bringing communities together to make the Detroit region the best it can be for young people and their families. Our panel is moderated by Craig Foley, a longtime public radio journalist. Without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Craig. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. I appreciate it. And I appreciate the opportunity to have what is a very, very important conversation. And, you know, as I was preparing for this, one of the things that I did was watch The Social Dilemma on Netflix, the documentary that's out there, taking a look at social media and its impact on society. And I came away from this really looking at my own social media habits. And so, April, I really want to start this conversation with you in that this has become such an important part of our everyday lives, whether we're adults, whether we're young people. As adults, maybe it's a little bit easier for us to see how we're manipulated by this in certain ways, but for young people, it might not be that obvious. But it certainly seems to me that the people that are in charge of social media, whether it's marketing in social media or the social media companies themselves, certainly seem to know about human behavior and have really found ways to trigger us, and not just trigger us, but also to push those buttons to make us do things a certain way. And I'm not sure that this is a genie that will ever go back in the bottle.
Well, Craig, you are absolutely right. So just by way of background, the first 20 some odd years of my professional career was spent in corporate marketing departments and PR departments of JetBlue, JCPenney, Kenneth Cole. And part of my job, in essence, was to do some of this work in social media. So there's a little bit of a background there. Since then, I am now fully dedicated to working in adoption, foster care, child welfare. So I have this interesting intersection that I'm also a transracially adopted person. So I have all of these different pieces of what brings us to this moment today, which the social dilemma definitely has us thinking deeply about. And the truth is, the genie is not going back in the bottle, right? So much so that we know now that this human data that it's called, right? All the things that are being compiled in service of business models and what they're calling now surveillance capital, right, is equal to gold. And it's looking at it from a financial perspective and point of view. This human data, which is gathered as we move around social media on websites and in our social media apps, its collection and then its value is that of gold today. The genie is not going back in the bottle, and I think it's incumbent upon all of us now to wrestle with that. And there's a lot of tension in that, which I know we'll get to throughout this conversation tonight.
Surveillance capital. That's a really disturbing phrase, actually, if you think about that in a lot of ways. Luana, I want to talk to you about that for just a second, because, you deal with the mental health aspect of this for just a second. And I sort of want to focus on that point about whether or not we know what is being done to us in terms of social media, and the level of understanding that people have about, frankly, just about how their brains are being picked every minute that they're on there. And it's not always a bad thing. I don't want to suggest that it is. But do people understand just the level of what's going on here?
I think, Craig, it's a complex answer, right? So what do we know? I mean, we know that a lot of time on social media has negative mental health consequences, although the data is mixed. We also know that sometimes social media can help connection. But you're talking about something interesting here, which is the idea that the way it's created, it sort of hits that part of our brain that is the reward center of our brain. And so it has that addicted feeling a little bit. And I think as social media sort of expands and exponentially, a lot of us that are adults might be understanding it, or at least feeling in our bodies, right? That you're on that Facebook or Twitter or whatever it is, and your heart is beating a little faster, you're feeling a little more anxious. I think the danger is when we go younger and our kids' brains are not fully developed. And so in that case, they don't know. And so I think it's a mixed answer, and one that's not all bad, as you said.
It's not all bad. I mean, and Robert, I mean, this is an important part of what we all do too. I mean, I'm on social media constantly promoting the work that I do, trying to get people to pay attention to it. And yes, I get the validation that everybody gets when somebody's clicked on a tweet that I put out there or something like that. I'm not immune to this thing. You work with a lot of young people as well. I'm guessing that feeling is probably a little bit more intense for them.
Yeah, I mean, when we survey the population that we serve, which is mainly the youth, they are, as Luana mentioned earlier, they're naive to understanding that the camera is on, right? And so when they go to this site and they're speaking to their friends, they're on there and they forget that the camera's on, it's live, and the challenge with social media is that you can't pull things back. Right. And so when things happen like this, as fast as it's happened, unlike in the past, there's no opportunities to train, because sometimes the adults aren't equipped to know what's even out there for the kids to have access to. So it really takes responsible community organizations like a Detroit PAL and others to be able to position these families and these youth to be better equipped to maneuver through this. You know, if you were thinking about a training, you probably need adults and children to be trained at the same time just to be equipped to do that.
Well, and anybody can answer this one, but it certainly seems as if the technology has advanced before our understanding of exactly how it is impacting us in a lot of different ways. You know, so as they make each new advancement in AI and trying to figure out what our likes and dislikes are going to be, you know, we're just starting to catch up to what they were doing 5 years ago in this. And that seems to be something that makes it difficult for parents. I have a college-age son, to sort of keep on top of exactly what's happening out there. And so when you talk about support structure, right, and what's needed here, and I guess anybody can answer this one, where are we when it comes to actually figuring this out? And or are we just starting to scrape the surface here?
Well, I can pop in real quick here. I think we're just starting to scratch the surface. So to be clear, there are some really smart, amazing individuals that are driving a lot of this, right? Some for really, really just purposes, and some for the purpose of this idea of, you know, human data and surveillance capital. And so what we have to know is that the folks that are building this do know and do understand, right? What they're sharing with us, right? That's why the Social Dilemma movie in the documentary, which you'll hear, you know, us reference a lot, I think, in this conversation, is one that just starts to give us a little bit more, some of what we maybe already knew or maybe thought we knew, but gives us a lot more detail in that, in things for further investigation. So I think that there are the professionals in the space that know, right? And you'll see in that documentary as it plays out, those that were in very much in service of the architecture of some of these systems have now moved in a 360-degree turn away from them and trying to figure out how to use what they know to help educate and inform all of us. So, you know, we are starting, I think, to understand the full, you know, the full reality of this, but it's going to take a lot of action in order to make it safer by our own account, on our own accord, not waiting for those that are sort of behind the structure of these things to do it for us.
Well, I think we've seen through congressional hearings in regards to this that they're not necessarily willing to step up to the plate in that regard. I mean, it certainly seems as if nobody wants to take real responsibility for the potential impact that this is having on our mental well-being, frankly. And Luana, I mean, we are, of course, obviously utilizing social media more now because of the pandemic. Many of these things were already starting to emerge before this, but this last year has given us a ton of time to sort of look at what's going on. Have we seen some of the impacts of social media and this quote unquote addiction you were talking about? Are we starting to see that manifest itself differently as a result of this quarantine time?
Craig, I've heard a lot about it, actually. So, you know, research is hard to catch up here, I think, because of some of the things we're talking about. It's moving so fast that by the time, you know, a researcher designs something, I can tell you clinically, what I hear is parents talking a lot about their teenager kids struggling a lot more with wanting to be on social media as well as not wanting to be on social media, serving as a way to connect and yet, you know, not being the cool kid anymore, having the contact. And so there's been this, at least what I hear clinically, this love-hate that parents are seeing and feeling like, how do I support my kid? What do I do here? Because they have a lot more time and also because people are in the same space together. So some of this as a parent, you might not have been able to catch as much, but if you're home with your kids, a lot of the time you're seeing someone that struggle a lot more. And that's certainly what I've been hearing from the parents that I work with.
Well, and before we keep going, I do want to let folks know there's a Q&A function that is here. And I know that a lot of people are raising their hands already, and we're going to get to questions. But if you've got questions, submit them now, because I do not want to suggest that I'm the only person that understands what a decent question is. I guarantee you there's a lot of people out there watching right now that have a better idea of how to do this than I do. So please submit your questions via the Q&A. I can see them and I will work them into the conversation. Take advantage of that technology that we have here. This is one of the good uses of the technology that we're talking about. You know, this is something that's interesting. And Robert, I want to get your take on this because, you know, again, you're working with a lot of young people. We have been engaging with this technology more and more over the last year. Are you concerned at all about whether or not we're going to be able to go back to the way things were, I guess, when this is over? Or is it going to be sort of a slowly, maybe it becomes a little bit less of our life when we actually start seeing people in person more often again?
Yeah, I think it's like anything. There's a lot of positive things that have come from uh, the social media, and as well as just us having to use different platforms. So I think we'll probably never go back, but I think we will appreciate those more intimate moments that we can have. Just a simple hug, just a simple voice that you can see right in front of you, versus having this virtual aspect. So, for instance, for us, our literacy program has improved because we've gotten more volunteers to go on virtually versus being able to meet in person and have to leave work. So, that's one aspect of it being a positive. But for a youth, you thinking about that interaction that you had with your friends, just being able to have those moments where you just go somewhere and it's just a quiet place and you just giggle and have that time. It's a struggle. When we surveyed them, there were more of our youth that talked about loneliness, depression, just feeling like they weren't being heard. And so I just think that we just have to be attentive. I think it really is an opportunity for families to come together and have meaningful discussions, to go back to some of those things that we used to do, like board games and things like that, to draw out, those conversations. You're just going to be doing more Thanksgiving dinners regularly, to have that engagement. And I think that's a positive effect if you're able to utilize that and really slow things down, in that way.
Well, for young people, and there's some great questions that are coming in, which I'm going to get to in just a second, and I'm just sort of trying to lead us in there. But for young people, I mean, that social connection that they have been lacking over these last several months has got to be something that's incredibly difficult. I remember what I was like when I was a teenager. I couldn't wait to get out of the house and go see my friends. That's what I wanted to do every day. My family was the last people I wanted to see. But the problem with social media communication seems to be that sometimes you don't have the nuance there in a conversation. You don't see the facial expressions. You don't see the body language. And Luana, I guess this would be a good one for you. Understanding what people are suggesting to us, do we take some of the things they say in social media more seriously than we would if we were seeing them face to face?
So I think it's different. I don't know if it's more serious, Craig, but I think for teenagers in particular, as you started, it's really challenging, right? Because it's also a time that you really fine tune your social skills, right? You're trying to sort of understand when you say this, what happens in body language and flirting with people and being present and all that stuff, sort of stimulating. It's lacking, and we know that social support and that need to belong, it's the strongest buffer against mental illness. And so we really have this gap on the ability to connect there in a real way. And then when we're virtual, I think there's a couple of different tendencies. One is maybe to take it more literal. The other one, and I've seen this a lot with young adults now, is that if you had any social skills deficit or any vulnerability, maybe you had a little social fear, now it's terrifying because you can be called on in front of everybody, literally, and everybody's looking at you. And so there's a lot more avoidance that I've seen in some of the young adults, because this virtual world elicits this additional piece. And let's talk about it. It's not natural to talk and look at yourself the whole time. And so there's also this feedback that I think affects our brains. Think about your day. If you're on Zoom all the time, by the end of the day, your brain is competing for it. And so I certainly think it's challenging. And I predict it might lead to a bit of a social skill deficit if we stay here for too long.
Yeah.
April, go ahead, Robert.
Yeah. And I was just saying, I mean, that's exactly what we're seeing. It's that comparator. And with social media, it's amazing how you can look at someone and just think they're living the best life, and you never realize that they could be dealing with something, right? And on the opposite end, they're showing all these emotions and they're just trying to help someone else through something, right? And so it's very challenging to be able to really understand where people are at and really give them some things to help them to cope through it, when they're on social media. Because like you're saying, a lot of times the parents not even around when they're on, and they're just acting off of impulse, and you just never know how it's occurring, you know, and what's impacting them.
Well, you know, that brings me to a question that came from the audience here, and I thought this was good. You talk about, you know, some kids don't have any sort of limits on their screen time or what they're doing. Their parents aren't paying attention. So there's a question that came in. It says, I struggle when my teen continually bucks the system because her friends have no limits. How do we effectively maintain their mental health and set those boundaries? Who wants to tackle that one?
I can, the non-parent parent can pop in and
That's
and
fine.
answer all the questions about teens. It's really goes back to a few things that I think Robert was saying, and also Luana was, you know, we're going to have to go back to some old school sort of parenting things and old school family time. We've got this time that we've come back into the home, right? And there's opportunity there. But as it relates to this idea of other, you know, comparing other families and other children, that's always going to be the case, right? Joey's dad said it's okay. Like, why, even within the family system, to be clear, right? Mom or dad or mom or other caregiver said it was all right. You know, that you can have that back and forth, you know, where there's boundaries here and not as many boundaries there. So I think that one of the biggest things to sort of settle on is, you know, as a family, create the boundaries and parents to live by those rules as well. If there's a system whereas everybody's phone or device is out of the rooms by a certain time or off by a certain time, if there's a co-constructed, you know, sort of time frame in which is we all agree upon to be on and off our devices, I think we can't do as grown-ups, we can't expect children, young people to do things we're not willing to do ourselves, right? So I think that's a big piece of this is in teens watching their parents kind of be engaged and then, you know, setting rules and boundaries. Now, parents and children don't have to, you know, live by the same rules also on some level. But I think in the social media space, it's important to have that sense of real commitment to each other. And, you know, the stronger the bond in the family, obviously, the easier it will be to deal with outside forces. The other thing to think about is bringing other families into your matrix, right? I know a family that has brought in other families that said, and not until 16 are our children getting smartphones. Right. And all this whole pod of families decided that that's what they would do. So then you sort of, you can combat that a little bit, but look, that's always going to be a teen's like go-to is like, Joey can do it. How come I can't? But I think if you kind of structure it where you've got another group of families around you that have the same kind of structure, you might be able to sort of balance that out a little bit.
Yeah. So the old parental answer, you know, well, if Joey's going to jump off a bridge, would you do that too? Still works in this day and age is what you're suggesting.
Well, I think so. I hope so. I mean, I think you know, it's hard with teens in that sense, but really creating that sense of transparency too, on some level with what your family is willing to do and sharing that with trusted other families too, right? So that you're on the same page and that there isn't as much room for that idea.
And I would just add the one thing is that, you know, a lot of times in growing up, a lot of times we're not given the manual for raising kids. And a lot of times it's just as simple as just making it plain. It's like if you go in and you're making a recipe for a chili, you're going to talk about the ingredients that are in there if you're trying to teach your son or your daughter how to make chili. And it's the same thing with social media. You need to stop and talk about the responsibility of your brand, being an individual. And even for civic leaders, when you're out there, you not only represent yourself as an individual, but when I post literally, I think in terms of how is that going to impact how individuals and donors and sponsors think about our organization, right? And so there is an important part that can be done just with simple questions of asking, you know, them, you know, how does it feel if this comes out? What would you, you know, think about, you know, before you post things? So I think it's just important dialogue and the questions that you ask, you know, each other.
And I agree with both of you. And I think the piece for parents, I think it's helpful. It's gonna feel challenging. It's a lot of strong forces they're pulling. And so really having that anchor and clear, I think if I love the idea of like clear, you know, values and boundaries and, you know, this is what we do here in modeling. And I agree with Robert, teaching through it, right? but it feels uncomfortable. And I just want to remind parents that, yeah, it's not hard. We don't have a manual. But sometimes when it feels uncomfortable, it's actually that we're doing the right thing.
You know, there's another question that sort of dovetails with this one that came in, and this is about, you know, setting those boundaries and doing it in a way that doesn't promote the drama that you get with young people when you make a decision that might not be that popular with them. So what is the best way to sort of, wean is not the right word, but to sort of maybe minimize the amount of time they spend on social media without the accompanying drama that may go with it?
I'll jump in first and then pass it on. I think the hard thing is this. It's not just about the boundaries, it's about consistency, right? And being very clear and not violating that. So kids really learn a lot through modeling. And so you're going to get that drama, as you're saying, but really that pushback or that escalation, because often we are giving a little mixed messages, right? It's not okay at dinner time, but if we're at the friend's house and I want to talk to their parents, then it's okay to watch at dinner time. And just that one time, you are violating something. The kid is learning, well, if I push hard enough, then maybe I can break here and there. And so I think about boundaries as a sandbox for kids, right? How big, depending on the age of the kid, how big is that sandbox? But if you're going to set it, you have to be clear about it. And the more you can explain and talk about it and allow them to have their emotions, but not cave, that tends to hold it over time.
Oh, go ahead, April, please.
Well, and the thing I would add to that, I would agree with that. And also that sometimes, you know, flipping this on its head, right? And joining in, let's make a TikTok together about how I'm going to draw back your social media time, right? Like, how do you then become part of that? And, you know, one of the great parenting tactics is to have a kid teach you something, right? And maybe investigate together, right? What are the private, what's behind Facebook and Instagram and TikTok and Snapchat? Let's look at the privacy statements. So let's look at that together. I mean, you know, if you're going to be doing something, the responsibility is on, you know, parent and young person to sort of fully understand. And then it's like, then for parents not to be afraid of that thing and not to turn it all the way off because that's not for you, but to kind of maybe sometimes steer directly into it so that you can learn something and you know, understand a little bit more versus that I'm going to take it away from you thing, which we know in parenting doesn't always work, if at all.
Right. Yeah, and then one vital part of parenting is that you also, you know, have an obligation to make some things a little painful for them by exposing them to these other things, right? I think a lot of us wouldn't try things if it wasn't for someone taking you somewhere when you didn't want to go. You didn't, you know, like it from afar and you ended up doing it. It may have been the best moment of your life. So I think you can't just say we're taking this away, but I think getting them out and taking a drive to go do something that you may not have done, or that's the value of community organizations that offer youth enrichment programming, sports programming, is that it's causing them to get out and be active and not have as much time doing one thing or the other. It's just like when you say you're going to keep them off the streets by playing a sport, it's also helping to protect them from that idle time of doing things on social media that can get them into those types of troubling spots. So I think it's not just removing it, but also helping them to think about things that can replace it.
Well, you know, I've got a question here that relates to this subject, but specifically for kids in foster care. The question is basically, how can we better promote the boundaries to kids without them feel like they're being punished, especially kids coming into our home from foster care, whom all they've had is screen time and connection, and true attachment maybe hasn't happened for them in a lot of ways in their life. This person says, I'd love to remove the smartphones and take away the need of media in every moment of our lives. But is it a different situation when you're talking about somebody that has maybe gotten most of their human connection from this, as opposed to that traditional family structure that we've been talking about?
Yeah, I mean, it's a tension I wrestle with so much. So I have a mentoring program for young people in foster care. And one of the things it has come up is, some of the grownups in the group, some of the mentors, you know, who are in a deeper sort of understanding, have a deeper understanding or a deeper connection to some of what is what is the downside of social media, which is the lack of privacy, the tracking and all the things. And we had a really sort of tough conversation about that, because the truth is that for so many of our young people who have been separated from family of origin and who have had other traumas in addition to that, you know, that is a lifeline. Some of their social media is a lifeline. And there's actually, you know, this idea that I think about a lot, which is it's a luxury, actually. It's a luxury to feel like I could take or leave social media. For some of these young people, it isn't even an option to not have it, because that is a sister, a sibling, a brother, an auntie, a kin or kith connection that is one that might only be kept through social media. And I'll just, a quick side note, when I did the search for my biological family, I found them first on social media, and it gave me an opportunity to breathe, to see them at a distance, to get a sense, not to stalk them, but to get a sense of who they were, where they were in their lives, and if it would be appropriate for me to reach out to them. So I think it's very, very layered when you come to more vulnerable populations of teens and young persons, especially when it comes to trafficking, when it comes to a lack of safety. So we have to really dig deeper and be even in more conversation about this, and professionals and parents need to like double down on the thought and the engagement around this for vulnerable youth.
You know, you both mentioned sort of mentoring, and I sort of wanted to get a sense to this from Robert and April here. You know, how have you had to alter sort of your approach to mentoring young people with the advent of social media? I assume you've been doing this for a little while. This has changed things in a number of ways. How has that altered what you've had to do professionally from a mentoring standpoint to make sure that you're reaching people the way that you want to?
Yeah, I mean, it goes back to listening, right? And so it's so important to, you know, if you're talking about you're dealing with the youth, you're dealing with anyone, to really, you know, what are some of the needs? And I think about what April was mentioning earlier, you know, from a marketing standpoint, social media is amazing because you can get so many people to reply instantly and be able to capture that data if you have the right equipment to now say, here's how we're going to go about getting this information in front of them, right? And so when I think about what we're doing with the youth, even during COVID, one of the biggest shifts that we did was that we really had to go back to our grassroots efforts when it came to meeting the public where they were, meeting the community where they were as a trusted source. So they weren't going to the governor to hear about what they needed to do for COVID. They weren't going to the mayor. They were going still to their mentors and their trusted sources, and they were using their phone still as that source. So we developed a 6 degree of separation, checking in saves life campaign, where we start talking about resources that were available and how to get to those resources. And that really connected with people where they were at and how they received information. So I think it's really about listening to your constituents and understanding where they're at, and then providing things in a way that they can receive it, right? And so I think that that's just one way about doing it.
You know, this is a good question, I think, for Luana here on this one, and that is, you know, we're talking about sort of dialing back the amount of time people spend on social media, trying not to make it a punishment. But I think one of the stats I saw in the slides that was going before the presentation started was that we spend an average of 2 hours and 8 minutes per day on social media, and I think that's probably a bit low, given that the research was probably done before COVID-19 hit us. But what is an amount of time that's acceptable? Who has determined whether or not, you know, how do we know?
Well, I think we have indicators of what we know. And I'll answer the question two ways. One is there's some research suggests that 30 minutes or less would be optimal, that more than that, it starts to be detrimental to your brain. But then I think it's hard when you put a hard line on this. It's hard to understand exactly, is it 30, is it 40, is it 20? You know, the way I think about this is, what is it doing to you, right? And all of us can think about this, right? What is it doing to what you're saying to yourself, what you're doing to your thoughts, to your emotions, to your behavior, right? Are you there just stuck and going through things because you're numbing out, or are you really connecting, having a conversation with somebody? And that's how I would think about it. I would limit it in terms of time, but also I would check in with yourself and with your family, right? What's the function of being there? And is it ending making you feel better or not? And if not, then perhaps it is too much time and we need to shift a little bit.
That's one of those things that, you know, but we probably don't recognize it in ourselves when we're getting to that point. Maybe we do as adults, but I still find myself, you know, on my phone, constantly reading the news, whatever I'm doing, it's still not interacting with the person that's in the room next to me. And I get yelled at for this on occasion because we all need to pay better attention, right? I mean, that's just the way that relationships work. But, you know, at what point do you have to, you know, have an intervention, I guess, with somebody and say, enough? What's the sign that you would suggest is like, this is clear that this is something that has taken on a larger role than it should?
I always think about function of things and what is it getting in the way? So why are you doing it? And what are you not doing by doing that? And you start to notice, I do think, you know, we're talking about this a lot more. And so I think most of us can tell when we're sort of zoning out a little bit. Right? The question is catching a little earlier. And I think when we get to intervention, I like prevention so much better. Right. And so I, you know, we have a little bowl in my house and my husband and I put the cell phone there before we sit at dinner, and that thing is going to stay there until my kid goes to bed. And yeah, I'll pick it back at 8 o'clock again, but that's 2 hours there. We have to take it away. I mean, I'm doing this. I don't know about you guys, but I've done so many Zoom presentations. What I learned is my phone cannot be next to me because there's this urge to pick it up. Right? I needed an intervention. It's in a different room. And so I urge us to think about prevention before intervention. But if it is interfering with your life, then it's time to get somebody to help you tone it down a little bit.
Right. What's interesting, I'm having a flashback. So you remember growing up, how many, you know, people that you knew, I don't think I was like that, but that would spend all night on their phone, just talking all night on the phone. And so now we have social media or the internet, and now they've just switched to something else that engages them during that time. You know, it's amazing to see that, because I'm thinking like I'm an offender when it started talking about when you get that message on your phone saying how much time you're actually spending on that phone and doing those different things. So I think it's definitely a struggle that all of us have. It's just, you know, how do you gain a grasp of it? You know, it's difficult at times.
Yeah. You know, Robert, it's interesting. I hear you and you say that wasn't something that you did. It wasn't something that I did either, to stay on the phone all night, because my parents wouldn't allow it. Mm-hmm. Full stop. Like it was a very clear boundary. That now, did we sneak and put the phone in the closet and roll up in a blanket and like, yes,
don't share all your techniques, April. Don't share all the techniques.
Absolutely did that. But it wasn't, and it's still today, I know there's something inside of me that's like, I shouldn't be doing this, you know, and that was because there was a consistent message of what was acceptable and what wasn't. And my parents did not stay up on the phone all night. That's not something they did, right? So it wasn't like I didn't see them do something that then I couldn't do myself, right? Like they didn't do it, we didn't do it. Now it's a simple equation, but it does go back to that idea of what does it look like to really investigate these things as grownups and model what it looks like to have a healthy relationship to technology and to modern elements of our lives, right? Because without that healthy relationship to that, it could go in any number of directions, which we know through statistics and data, from the light stuff to the heavy stuff and everywhere in between, the problems lie.
There's a question that I want to get to in just a second, but somebody asked this a while, and before I lose it in this big list of questions that I have here, I do want to talk about this because we're talking a lot about Facebook, Twitter, things like that, TikTok, but video games, Fortnite, even Roblox for younger kids, but there's a chat function in there. There is, oftentimes they have people talking in their ear, and I know just from listening to some of these things, this can be some very abusive spaces for young people. It's not as if they even know who you are or anything like that, but the insults are fast and furious. They're continuously going on. And, they may not necessarily be on Facebook or texting somebody, but they are interacting socially with someone. So people are wondering about the video games and whether or not we're paying enough attention there to the types of interactions that kids may be having when it comes to that group.
Well, it's highly problematic for a lot of reasons. One, recognize that there are those platforms to play, right, and interact with other folks, which we don't know who those people are on the other end. And then there are the adjacent elements that, you know, you're on Twitch and you're on Discord at the same time where you're playing your Fortnite, right? So there are all kinds of ways to be engaged, not just in the game, that are quite intricate, quite frankly, and such that sometimes parents just absolutely do not understand them. They had no idea that, oh, that this was happening and that was happening and this was happening. So the adoption of some of these ways in which young people are creating their own path to engaging and doing so with Finstas, like an Insta, and there's your Finsta, like your Instagram that your parents can't find, right? So it's moving so quickly that it's really incumbent on parents to sort of, even the question itself, is Fortnite, are they the same thing? Well, we can put them in the same container. No matter what we call them, the dangers are the same, right? And then they get more complicated the more intersectional the engagement is with all the different pieces. So it's put it in one big container of social media, call it what you want. The investigation into what those things are, what the privacy is, who's on the other end, that's one piece. The other piece of this is that the performative nature of this and the back and forth of the bullying and the bossing around and the I'm the boss, like I'm in charge. Even just hearing the way that some of those conversations occur is highly problematic.
And you know, something that, you know, younger kids especially may not understand. And the thing is, I mean, I know people, adults, who will be on some of these games like Call of Duty and things like that, and they'll be yelling at some kid who's probably 12 years old on the other end, you know, and not even realizing that they're engaging in this sort of way. And so you talk about modeling good behavior. I think we as adults don't do it as often as we perhaps should. So that's enough commentary for me on that one, though.
Right. I'll throw in
go ahead, Robert,
monkey
please.
wrench, right? So there's colleges that are now offering scholarships for playing video games, right? And so some of these gamers are becoming six-figure youth who are now competing on a national scale, right? So there's some positive things, but I think with everything, there's moderation, right? There's a discipline to it. There's structure. You know, when we think about, you know, train up a child, right? And so these are healthy habits that we're trying to develop with them. So within the structure that we provide for them as adults, we help them to be able to maneuver in every aspect of their life to have them be more transferable skills. I think about it as, I had a 4-year-old who's running around. He would stay on the video game all day if we allowed him to stay on it, right? And it is a great babysitter at times when he is there, he's content, he's playing it. And even when he's on there, I don't know the games. I think at one point he was doing something and I heard him counting, and he was counting in Spanish because he clicked on something and he was learning Spanish right before our eyes, right? And so it's just showing you that you just have to be attentive, but you also have to be able to build that structure for them that will help them throughout the rest of their lives. I think it's just something that we have to be more accountable for and responsible for as parents.
Yeah. I thought Luana was going to say something, but she was just agreeing with you, Robert. So that's a good thing.
Totally agreeing and thinking about how challenging it is, but how important it is, and how it can be helpful, right? There's this part that can be helpful. I have a 3.5-year-old, and he gets 15 minutes, and he has to be in Spanish or Portuguese, and he's speaking both of the languages. And so he asks before he has to change. So I think there's a sweet spot for each family. Just have to get there.
Mm-hmm. We'll continue on here. And I just want to remind folks, if you've got questions, please, there's a Q&A function at the bottom. I can see them and I will bring them into the conversation. And I'm trying to do them in some sort of an orderly fashion to keep this all moving the way that I'd like it to. But please, I appreciate your contributions so far. They've been really, really great. So keep them coming. Some good comments there. This was from an anonymous attendee who says, I'm concerned that my child isn't developing strong social skills for face-to-face communication. Part of it is COVID, part of it is social media, but there's no real trying at real-time communication. I'm not sure if this is something, Luana, that studies suggest is something that will follow you through to adulthood or not, but that does seem to be something that a lot of parents are worried about.
I mean, social skill deficits certainly could follow you, but they don't necessarily do. I mean, we have to remember that kids are often very resilient and that there's this natural exposure that can help you overcome it. You know, I share this story often that I moved from a little town in Brazil to a big town, and I got from being extrovert, super introvert, and wanting to not do anything. And it took my grandmother to take me to the mall and talk to strangers for me to know, oh, they're just human beings, right? And so I think for parents, if you're noticing a social skills deficit, I think it's really important to then interact with your kid. And for example, do things like read books that teach some basic social skills and ensure that you are teaching, communicating, telling stories, or, pausing and talking about cues. You certainly have a lot of power as a parent to be able to start to develop that. And then I would trust that we are going to get to something that resembles more social interaction eventually. And at that point, kids are resilient. And so I wouldn't be so scared, but I would prevent it if you're seeing it by teaching it.
Very good. I appreciate that. There's a couple of other questions that I want to get to from the audience before we get onto a different discussion that I want to get to. Mimi says, can you talk a little bit about the connection between low self-esteem, loneliness, and social media? So whoever wants to tackle that one, I think all of you have experience in regards of dealing with those sorts of issues. So whoever wants to jump in first, feel free.
I'll jump in and then I'll pass it on.
All right, go ahead.
I mean, I think that data suggests strongly that that being on social media a lot can lead to loneliness and feeling isolated, which then is a risk factor for more severe mental health distress. And so we definitely have that signal across different platforms. And so it's something to watch out for and be concerned about.
And I'll just speak about comparison. So I think before we started, everybody was dressed up. So they're like, I'm not wearing a tie, so I'm going to take my tie off officially. But there's a comparator, right? It's watching people, and then you're thinking like, wow, I should have wore a white shirt versus a black shirt, right? But I didn't have a white shirt, So I mean, it's just something natural, and it's just so right in your face now when it comes to these comparators of believing that mindset. What's interesting, what was said earlier, is that we're competing against a computer that has an algorithm to be able to say if being social means that you're attracted to negative things, all of a sudden you're getting more of those negative feeds, which now feeds into your psyche, right? And the same thing where you have these people that are saying these positive things, or they're quoting scriptures or these affirmations, they're now getting more of those things because it's typical that you are around those types of people more. And so that's what makes it challenging, is that you almost are self-prophesying to create this atmosphere that now is surrounding you in that way. So it's just interesting, because you're competing against a computer that has this algorithm to set you up and allow you and make you sometimes be social in that way.
Well, and I think this is probably the right time to sort of bring up what happens in our world broadly, in the macro, happens in the micro in social media, which is racism.
Yeah.
And a lack of, fair sort of access to certain things. And, we'd be really kidding ourselves if we thought that, this is, we know that this is something that we have to contend with in real time, in social media and all the places. And, for me, it's an opportunity on some level to engage in that activism and that some of the community building. But we have to be very, very careful for young people that are already vulnerable, kids of color, right? Already vulnerable to any number of mental health challenges, any number of things that are disproportionately impact them and their families. That social media, on top of that, we just can't forget about the realities that our young people are facing in those areas. And I do see this in some of the the groups that I run, where there's a tension with what is happening real time for kids of color, just as it is happening in life, in the moment, in the presence of other human beings. The same thing happens online, and it's something that doesn't get as much attention as it probably should. which means if you're parenting or if you're mentoring a kid of color that's in the social media space, that's you double down on some of the things that you're doing and engaging with them in order to keep them psychologically, emotionally, and physically safe.
Right.
Oh, go ahead, Robert.
Yeah, I'll share a story. So I went to see my niece yesterday, and she was doing this Black History Month thing, and she was writing about colors, and she said, I know people say they don't see colors, and she says I do, and when she said it, I see all of them, and I think they're beautiful, right? And she says I love all the colors, and what was interesting is I then paused and I was thinking that the harsh reality is that there's some that will cause her to think differently, right? And so when you think about the cultural conditioning that's out there, nowadays, when it's talking about marginalizing, underestimating, undervaluing her just because of her color, that you have to equip them, especially with social media, to be able to understand, no, you're right. You are beautiful. You are strong. You are all these things in spite of what you may now encounter. It's not if you encounter it, it's when you encounter it. And so it's equipping them now, even with social media, when they're not protected and all of a sudden they get this harsh reality from this clip that comes across and you see someone unfairly treated or spoken to, or this bullying that takes place because of someone's color or culture or religion. So it's really a time when you think about organizations in the community to step up, and you have to be able to equip these young people to be able to withstand those types of things.
This is one of those things that's always sort of, bothered me a whole lot, though, is that we're putting a lot of the burden of figuring this out on the victims of this type of racist behavior and not equipping our kids to be nice in the first place, to not go down that road, to not participate in this sort of thing, and to actually act like decent human beings. A lot of times young people don't necessarily understand the impact of their words. They're impulsive. They'll say something stupid, not recognizing that they have hurt somebody. What do we need to do to better equip people to be good citizens online and not go down that road and decide that their first instinct is to try to hurt somebody else?
Well, I want to jump in real quick on this because, when you look at when you look at what's happening behind the scenes in some of these engines, these search engines, the way in which we're moving through our online territories, right? It's set up for us to fuel some of that negativity and some of that kind of confirmation bias and confirmation racism, right? Like you can find your people online, right? So I think I want to separate that out for a second, because to your point, Craig, we can't stop those individuals from behaving in that way. I wish we could. But what's the scary part of all this is why anybody who wants to dig deeper here, watch The Social Dilemma, talk about it, like think about how you've been led down a path of, kind of down that rabbit hole, right? And sort of investigate that, because knowing more is going to make you tune in, and your radar is going to go up a little bit more on that, which you can't control necessarily. I mean, there are some very intricate ways. This is probably not the webinar for that. Some very intricate ways to sort of to control that, and but too intricate probably for now. But that said, all the more reason to move with urgency on keeping these conversations, going and creating that safety for kids, because you cannot control the ugliness that's out there. So you have to have some kind of a family processing time, right? A grown-up processing time where you can say, did you see this, honey? I saw this. This is how I felt about it. Take whatever time you need to make sure you're processing it as a grown-up, so that you have your words and you have the ability to confidently steer into a dialogue that will be activated, will be emotional, and will be very difficult, but necessary. So I think there's this reality, Craig, that we live with, but it isn't impossible as grown-ups to be in purposeful and proactive conversation about what we know young people are seeing. And if we don't do that, then the problems just get incrementally more intricate and dangerous.
Yeah, and I'll add just one quick point. One of the things that we teach a lot is just their controllables. They control their actions, their attitude, and their behavior, right? And when you think about it, here's two things that I was told. This wise person told me. was that in these difficult times in life, right, they're always going to be there. They're going to come up. Is that the thing that you need to hope for and to pray for is, what am I to learn? Right. And so that's really good dialogue that you can have with anyone after any circumstance, any challenge. You can show your vulnerability. What am I to learn no matter what occurs? And then the second one is, how am I to respond? Right. And so those are two valuable things that can help you through the most difficult times in your life and challenging times, but it really allows for encouraging dialogue that you can have with your youth or even any adult at any age to talk about those two things.
Yeah.
Go ahead, Luana, please.
No, I was just thinking that, I totally agree, Robert. And I think this idea, though, that we can pause and as an adult makes a lot of sense. But, teenagers really can't. They don't have a pause button, especially if you have a trauma history. It doesn't exist. They don't know how to access it. And we know that, just even being on the news for at least, we have data, for example, that watching things, they're activating. Like after the marathon bombings here in Boston, 6 hours of news watching led to more trauma symptoms than actually being there during the marathon bombings. And so I think, Gabriel, to your point, like we have to be able to set the parameters and talk about those things because they are exposed to things that are traumatic. Right. And if you have any history and vulnerability, then your brain is filtering it to confirm that there is something wrong with you. And then your behaviors are going to be consistent with it. And so I do think it's important to sort of elevate and think about at the society level and the individual level, and that we as family members have a responsibility here.
Yeah, it's a difficult thing to talk about. I mean, it's not the kind we all, I think, have this tendency to want to shelter our children from the ugliness of the world. At what point do you start bringing this up with kids, especially if they're going to be on social media? Because as we pointed out, 8-year-olds have iPads. Phones are getting into hands younger and younger. This is a difficult conversation to have. When's it appropriate to actually, tell your kids that there's some really horrible people out there?
Well, it's never too soon. I think there's age appropriate ways. I mean, your kid the best, right? You're going to if you're paying attention, every kid has a different level of learning and ability to understand things. And it's just never, I don't think it's ever too soon to start the conversations. And if you are a family that is in regular conversation and deconstructing difficult things, especially in the media, if that's just what you do as a family, that's how your kids will start to sort of, they'll hear you. They'll kids, as I always say this, especially adopted kids or kids from foster care, we have big ears. Mm-hmm. We can hear you. We even recognize your body language we can tell that you can say everything's fine, but we can tell that you're not fine. And so there's such an important level of practice that I think parents and grownups need to start to really do proactively, to say, even with colleagues or other adults and grownups, to get more practiced about having the conversation, because it's when you don't have your words or when you're activated emotionally and you can't sort of process with a young person, that's when it doesn't work for anybody. So you first have to sort of process through it and make sure that you know what you've seen. Like, what did I see? How do I feel about it? What do we do about it? Right? Ask yourself those 3 questions. And then if you make that a part of your family structure and how you see difficult things and talk about them on social media or otherwise, you'll have a sort of a way in which, an operating system in which your family can manage what is uncontrollable in the world, really, right? And the last thing is, you can't look away from it. I mean, I hear a lot of parents say, we just don't do that. We just don't watch it. Well, guess what? Your kid is. So that's cute and nice, and that's good for you. That's a luxury if you think you can sort of put your head in the sand. You don't be a news junkie, but you can't completely shut off what is happening in the world, because your kid will see it, and then you won't have your words or that strong foundation to have that important conversation with your kid.
Yeah.
Totally
well,
agree.
I've got a follow up to that was I actually thought was pretty interesting here. It says, what do you do when your child is resistant to parent support? Now, if you've tried to approach a child who might be an easily victimized child due to race, orientation, awkwardness, whatever is something that they may be picked on for, if their child is so uncomfortable or refusing to share or discuss with the parents, any tips as a family when reaching out is taken as punitive to that child?
Yeah, I would just speak to the power of mentors, the power of exposures to different people. We always talk about and you'll hear about it takes a village. It truly does take a village. You think about helping youth find their greatness, which is our mission. It's really around giving them these exposures and experiences to sometimes someone that sees the world the way they see it. And it's amazing if you keep exposing them to these different people and they're out there, they want to give back. They will find their voice and they'll find someone that they can relate to in that way. And to have that, you just can't stop because you can't communicate with them in that way. So I just think mentoring is a big and important way you can address some of those things.
And Luana, though, I mean, it seems to me one of the difficulties there is that the parents may not know who those mentors are, especially if you're talking about, like, say, an LGBTQ situation where a child has not come out yet, or maybe doesn't want to tell the parents about something like that. Getting them that sort of support or finding them a support network in some capacity got to be difficult, I'm guessing.
Mm-hmm. It's challenging, but I actually go back to what April talked about, which is if you're addressing difficult topics, if you're teaching your kids about emotions early on, if you're sitting at the table and having conversations, then you're creating that fertile ground that the kid feels more connected, that the kid can approach you, right? Because once that wall is up, yes, it's hard. And sometimes it's time to really seek some professional help that we can't get them out of it, right? As parents, we are not trained professionals, no matter if you are in the area. I don't think that, I'm the professional for my kid. And so I do think it's about approaching it. And then the thing that I think many of us have talked here, listen, listen, listen.
Mm-hmm.
We go in to try to solve problems. Kids sometimes just need you to sit with them and just listen. And maybe that you're listening to silence for a little bit and you don't like it, but guess what? That's still being with them and listening. And so I really think it's important about just stay with it.
Yeah, it's it's a brave new world we're entering here on this kind of stuff. Quick reminder for everybody: we've already got an hour into this conversation, which is great. But we have a number of questions from people, and if you have a question, there's a Q&A function at the bottom of this. Please feel free to submit them. We've got a lot of comments that are coming in the chat. So I'm trying to sort them out here and make sure that I get to everybody. This is something that I thought was interesting from Melissa, who says, yeah, let's do Melissa real quick, because I thought this question was interesting. She says, what is a smart way to teach kids about internet predators? Human trafficking is huge in my area through social media. Do I scare them by showing them local sex offenders and news articles? That's, I thought was an interesting question. Scared straight, I guess, going back to the 1970s here. Who wants to tackle that one? Is it an effective strategy? I mean, do you scare them, or do you just try to tell them that this is a real part of the world?
I think it's very particular to a family and to a kid. Like I said, every kid is different, right? Every kid has their own way in which they learn. And thanks to technology on some level, right? We have narratives in movies and TV, right? Do a quick search of, I was looking for something the other day about, racism and Friends, right? And there's a great, and code switching, there's a great Mixed-ish episode that I pulled to talk about with a family, right? So it's like, you can look up narratives in TV shows that may be age appropriate that you can bring in as evidence, and maybe even plant and be like, oh, I saw this show. I mean, you can do any number of ways. Or if you think your kid's not going to buy that, then just say, hey, there's something I want to watch with you. I mean, thankfully there is a lot of content out there that you can use to help you. It doesn't have to be the hard-hitting news story. It could be a narrative that's out there that might be more appropriate for your kid to explore, right? And then the other thing is, this is not a one-shot conversation. Mm-hmm. You're going to have to revisit these hard things over time. And then, it's going to take, the driving in the car moment. It may take the walking moment. It may take over dinner moment. It may take a harder hitting conversation at some point that says, we're sitting down for a family meeting right now because something happened in our neighborhood, right? There's going to be any manner in which you discuss this conversation. And to Robert's point, it takes a village. If there is something that you think needs to be addressed in your family system, and there are trusted friends and folks that are really influential in a kid's life, you can organize that, right? Not to be manipulative, but to be practical, and to get that person on the squad and the team and say, hey, this is important, right? Even doctors, right? Think about doctors that you go in and you can call the doctor beforehand to say, hey, I'm coming in. Is there any way we could work this into our visit?
Right.
Right. I mean, there are certain ways that you can, use the power you have, right? Because it's not an easy journey, to be clear, but you do have teammates. And if you think about it and get them invested, there may be other ways in which the message comes through.
Yeah, and I'm a sports guy, police athletic league. And so when you think about it, there's just not one play that causes you to have success, right? So you have to try different approaches because all these kids, all of us are different, right? And so I always say you can't wait till sugar honey iced tea hits the fan, right? And now you're sitting there trying to figure out, what are you going to do now? You need to address some of those things in a preventative way. It's situational leadership. So when I was at Pfizer, and we would do all these trainings, and we would think about, even though you come of age, you're now 13, and I'm going to allow you to go on to the internet, for instance, and if that's the age that you choose to go on there, are you going to let them just go on without being able to put some parameters or some trainings and some thoughts to, you don't put your information out there, you don't go out and try to meet people in person, you make sure that what you put out there is going to be out there forever. So you're going to still give them some boundaries and some type of orientation in spite of them coming of age, right? And unfortunately, some of us were already of age, right? And we were allowed to just go on to social media, and hence we have story after story when people lose their job, when people are now challenged with the things that they put out there that are coming back to haunt them. I think about it now. If you're interviewing someone, unlike in the past, you now can go on a person's social media and you'll see things that were never talked about, their religious preferences, their social people that they connect with. You can get all these things. So people just really have to be understanding of that. And even for youth, it's even more important that you orientate them during that time in a preventative way versus just saying, have at it, you can do it now. So
yeah, interestingly enough, I actually hired a person once and did discreetly tell them that they should maybe take down the pictures of them at the bar every single night, with a different cocktail in their hand and talking about how much fun they're having. I said, hey, you may want to take that down a little bit. There's a couple of that brings something up though, Robert. You talk about you let them on there. We want to set them up for success, but there's a couple of different comments that have come in here that sort of link together. One said, I was so disappointed with parental controls and what that was safer and how quick and exposed we all felt. The fact that we counted on these technology companies and a couple of technological things that we may have to allegedly keep bad content away from kids. And then the other person was concerned about how we as parents and as caregivers keep up with what kids are doing and these new platforms that are coming up all the time. It does seem that we had a false sense of security with technology. Let's start with that one for just a second. April, this is your area.
I love it.
I mean, it's all marketing, right? I mean, to be clear, right? The same people who are building these platforms in such a way to keep us on them, to keep us going down rabbit holes, to keep us buying certain things, are also creating what are so-called parent controls, right? That do give a false sense of security. So that really makes it important that parents don't just use that as the only way in which things can be controlled and managed, right? You have to have those things. You have to understand what the privacy is. You have to look under the hood. You have to be very, very diligent. And then you have to have your own rules and what works for you as well, which could be even more rigorous than what parental control would be. Now, in terms of keeping up, I would say, find yourself a really savvy teen, right? find yourself a really smart,
You
savvy
probably
team.
have one with you already. I mean,
right? Well, exactly. But, you know, even someone who can sort of school you on some of the things that you need to know. Common Sense Media is a great website for that. The Tech Savvy Mama is a podcast that's really good. There are, and you know, just, you know, look, the other thing is you can do some searching to find what works for you. You know, there are podcasts, there are books, there are, you know, articles. Common Sense Media is great. You can look at that too. So there's something for everyone really in terms of what is kind of breaking down what you need to know. And then the other piece is we live in a time where now if you're not finding it, get with a friend and create it, right? Like get with a friend and create it, because you know, this is the time where we are kind of this community model of crowdsourcing our answers to certain questions. And the last thing I'll say is hold companies accountable, right? And just as much as you look at the label for what's in your food that you're bringing in the door, make sure you're investigating the privacy of certain sites and that you're on and that your kids might be on. And I know it seems like they're untouchable, but the more people that do reach out and do share, the more we'll be, you know, I think the more we'll be working in service of deconstructing some of this. But, you know, it's going to take everybody to sort of play some kind of a role.
So one of the points of the question was, you know, is there a way to set up a smartphone in a way that will prevent some of these sites from being reached and some of this content from getting there? It sounds to me as if what we're suggesting here is that relying on the tech companies to somehow police what's there is probably not a wise strategy. There is no quote unquote safe phone, I'm guessing.
Not that I know of. Not that I know of. You know, it really is about creating the structure for you and what is important for you, and then deciding on how you want it, what sites are available, what sites are no-nos. It's like it really, there is no safe way to do it with and count on the companies that are bringing you these things to help you do that. To my knowledge, it doesn't exist. If it does, let us know, because I've not heard of such a thing. That's foolproof, right? That's totally and completely safe, aside from not being on them at all.
Well, which is probably unrealistic in this day and age. You know, I got an interesting question here from Michelle, who says, can you address some of these situations with foster kids specifically? Because we can address easily with our own kids. We've had a little bit more consistency there, perhaps, than kids in foster care have had with, but foster children may not have been raised in the same way that you're trying to raise your own children or you were raised yourself. This has got to be somewhat difficult, Luana, sometimes to, you know, get somebody, especially a young person who has been able to do whatever they want, to all of a sudden accept some limits and rules that they're not comfortable with.
Absolutely. You're changing their whole view of the world, right? What's expected of them, what they can do, what they can't do. And we get to this attachment level. Can I trust you? What are you doing to me? Is that reasonable? And, you know, when you're in foster care and when you have any kind of challenging upbringing, trust is difficult. So when you have an adult telling you what to do and not to do, can you even trust them? And so I think the first piece is that relational piece, right? Creating a safe space where you can start to engage with that kid. I think the worst thing to do is just put a wall up immediately and say no, unless it's really dangerous and you think like it's a no-no. But I think walking towards boundaries and working towards a safer environment, showing that you can trust. Trust is not transferable, right? And we can't trust everyone. And at times we move in between homes and things are really bad. And so I really think it's really working with the kid where they're at, starting to put some boundaries. And if the kid is a little older, you can talk to them about it. You can explain what's happening. You instead of black and white, you invite them. I loved what April said, you know, invite them into this conversation with you, learn from them. What's the utility of it for them? And how can you find a boundary that's reasonable? And you can do some good with that. We anecdotally did a scholarship for 150 inner city youth this summer. And I can't tell you how much I learned about TikTok and making videos about cognitive behavior therapy for other youth. And it was incredible, right? And I probably would have said, oh, I don't want to do TikTok. And then my entire staff was like, but that's what they're doing. So we're going to learn from them, but we're going to teach them how to do it so that helps their brain. And that's what I think we need to sort of create flexibility around.
I think that the additional layers to this with foster youth, pertain to this idea of also power and control, right? There is such a lack of that in so many foster youth, their lives. And these are some levels of freedom and connectivity that they bring with them. These are senses of comfort, right? That have been part of their system of operation. And so just also that coming into this, with some of that control that this is for me, this is mine. We have to be super sensitive to that and work with grace on some level, even while trying to keep the safety factor to a high degree. Then there's the layer of what happens when you've got an extended family through adoption and foster care. It's no different than divorce and remarriage, right? You have a parent that is no longer parenting day in and day out, but someone that is of influence to your child. And we work that out. We know when we're doing that poorly, we know we're doing it well, right? Like when, a kid can manipulate certain things between parents, we know that we've got to check ourselves. But, when it comes to having family of origin in the matrix in terms of connectivity to a child, and that family is like no boundaries with social, or more boundaries with social, right? You could go either direction. What does that look like to manage? And it's no different than managing any situation with your kid that there's other influential people in their life. It's a conversation that has to be had with the grownups. It's the grown-up's job to organize this, right? It's the grown-up's job to be ahead of the curve, to say, hey, if Joey says that he can do social media for 6 hours, he can't.
There's a question that came in though, and that somebody said, hey, I've got foster kids and they came into the home with tech items that were paid by their biological family. How do I get that under control? Because, again, there's a whole lot that goes on there, but it certainly seems as if, you don't want to start this relationship with conflict, but it's going to go there.
It's going to go there. And I think you definitely have to recognize that there is going to be conflict, but it goes back to some of the things we should have already been doing, especially with the deconstruction and reconstruction of families through adoption and foster care. We need to have more relationships with the entire family of adoption and foster care, right? We can't just, graft a kid onto a new family and that's it. And no, we actually have to have these open dialogues about what is happening with the kid for the specifically child-centered, right? And that means that the grown-ups really have to, it's hard, right? It's hard. They may do things that you don't like, and you may do things that they don't like, but that has to kind of go and melt to the edges while you kind of go to and behave and model what it looks like to be in right relationships, so that there isn't that space for, to slide in extra time or to do things that could potentially be dangerous. And I say that it's not easy, right? I get it. I know there's some parents sitting going like, yeah, easy for you to say, April, right? But to be clear, like, the truth is also that when you are open and honest with that extended family situation, and you say, hey, I'm going to tell, your other parent, I'm going to tell however we refer to them, right? I'm going to tell them your screen time rules, right? And so just so I'm going to tell them that, so that, we're all on the same page and we're going to talk about it together, right? So I think there's that, it's like what we should be doing all along, but the social media moment and many other moments that we're meeting make it urgent that we're doing that and really working at those relationships.
Yeah, and I would just add that the key thing that was said was just that safe place, right? And so when you think about how do you create that safe place, you have a mutual purpose, you have mutual respect, right? And sometimes when just because they're a youth, we can, talk about purpose, meaning a goal, but not really think in terms of that respect factor, right? And so that's where we get into the fight or their flight. They're just not paying attention, or they're going to do what they're going to do anyway, right? So I think those are just lessons in crucial conversations that need to be done and helping people to have those conversations. And in any relationship, when there's a lack of trust, then there's a lack of known intent. And so then you start creating and using a fact and creating your own story in a judgmental way or in other ways that can be detrimental to building and establishing that relationship. So I know it's difficult, right? Because we challenge with that just with our relationships on the job or regular relationships, and now you bring in someone who may have had trauma or had some other challenges and you're trying to do that. But I really think if you start with aligning goals, finding something that they're interested in, like the person mentioned earlier, Fortnite, if they're interested in Fortnite, how do you use that and leverage that and saying, wow, it seems like you're interested, let's dig into this, and set some goals with that, that can help them do that, but then also align some, but here's some other things that you need to do. It's that respect, it's that reaching them where they're at and now leveraging that. And that's what great mentors do. That's what good communicators do. And it's a skill that can be developed, and there's ways to develop it. The last point I'll say is just this Google age, like we did this, Zoom session with the kids, and they were talking about, we were like, how do you discover what's facts and not facts on social media? And they were all like, oh, I'll Google it, right? I'll hear of someone that may have passed away or something that occurred, and I'll see if it came across multiple feeds before I go out and repost it or reshare it, right? So it's amazing how, people can Google most things and find out the step here or YouTube it and find these different things and really become proficient in a quick way to at least give you some types of things that may have worked or things that you can at least try. So it's amazing what's out there just by one click of the button. I started to Google what you were saying earlier to see if it was there as to how do you stop a phone from being able to, allow someone to have all those access points. So it's out there, I'm sure, though. I'm sure it's something out there.
Well, we've spent a lot of time talking about ways for parents and caregivers to sort of navigate this world. But I do want to talk about things. We haven't spent a lot of time talking about how we recognize when things are out of control, when things are getting bad. And I definitely want to spend some time talking about that. Before I get into my first question about that, though, I want to remind folks, if you've got questions, please use the Q&A function that is there at the bottom of the screen. You can submit your questions. I've been getting to a lot of different subjects that way, so I appreciate everybody's input so far and the comments that have been coming in. But recognizing when it's becoming a problem, I'm not sure. Every kid is different, right? Are there any tried and true signs that you can look at and that just sit there and say, clearly this has become an issue? Is it ever that simple, Luana?
It is so hard because I mean, I think April said this a few times. Every kid is different, and even though I'm a clinical psychologist, I'm very cautious on putting labels on things, right? And so I think you do know your kid best, and you know yourself best, and I go to like patterns, right? Situations over time. So if every time your kid is upset, the only thing they do is social media or go on the phone, or every time that you invite them for dinner, they want to go take a nap, or you approach a difficult conversation and they numb out. And so it's like there's things that you look for, right? Patterns of sadness or anxiety or sleeping or numbing. But I really cautious us to really think about is like, my kid, and has anything changed significantly? Because quite honestly, some of us, I had a colleague that had this horrible thing happen, that she knows all the signs and her kid had a suicide attempt. And so sometimes it's really hard to catch it. And I think that's where I think, April and Robert talked about this a lot, sort of that relational component, knowing your kid, being present with your kid, trying to understand, because you're much more likely to catch a shift that is going in the way that's negative if you're there present versus not. And so I don't want to put a box in here. I'm going to say, let's show up, be in the present moment, watch, look at patterns.
It's interesting, though. I was watching cable news today, and one of the stories they did was on an uptick in depression amongst young people, blaming it on COVID, but a lot of it was being blamed on an increased use of social media as well. And it seems to me that we're always looking for something to blame for these types of situations rather than taking a look at the whole here. And I'm wondering if social media is getting perhaps more blame for what we're seeing right now than it should? Or are we putting the blame where it belongs? I mean, I don't want anybody to sort of answer that definitively, but it does seem we try to oversimplify the answers to these problems sometimes.
I mean, we like certainty, right? As human beings. And so we want certainty, and we want to be able to point a finger.
The one thing we never have.
Right. But look at this. The data suggests that between 14 and 26, or 14 and 26, there is an increased level in depression and anxiety. And it has been consistent, but it was creeping up before COVID. Right. So it's a shift on the curve on prevalence. It's not like out of suddenly we have a sharp increase. The prevalence is going up, and there's many factors, right? Modern life, parents being split, lack of social support, no extended family, racism, discrimination. I mean, you can put the factors there. Yeah, social media is one of those factors, but I don't think we can slice that pie and say that is the only factor or the biggest factor for that matter, right? It may be accelerator for kids that are already in vulnerability, but I think the increase in depression, particularly anxiety we've seen, it's global, right? And it's in low middle income countries. And so there's something there that's not just social media, in my opinion.
Well, go ahead, April, please.
Well, and I have such a, I hold parents in such a, in such an esteemed place, because it is hard, and there's almost no room for parents to mess up. Right? There's almost no room for parents to mess up when I need some extra help and support. Well, who do you call? Right? On the extreme side, we have child welfare. No one's going to call child welfare on themselves, and say, I need some help and support. So we have this real problem just societally that, everybody's supposed to be okay and fine and doing good. And there's so much shame attached to, parenting, in a way that if your kid's not the best and doing all these things, and there's so much shame in that. So I think there's social media is an easy target. There's certainly reasons why it is a target, but there's also this, how are we supporting families? How are we encouraging the skills and the support of parents today, and giving them all that they need in order to parent in this really unprecedented time with all the things that we have going on. So I hope that what would be an amazing thing would be if we could find ways in which to use these platforms to build up parents, to give them more resources, to give them more support, to give them more love, to give them all the things that they maybe didn't get when they were kids, right? In order to be even better as parents, be as best a parent as they could be. So I just, if there are parents listening, I love you and you can do it, and all the things, because this is hard, and social media does not help the cause.
Right. And I'll just mention that it was never meant for us to do it alone. Right. I think when you talk about the power of it takes a village. You have to understand that there are all these different resources out there. And a lot of times it's awareness, it's access and utilization. So we talk about equity, and those are some of the challenges that we face in society, is that there's not equity with some of those resources, meaning people aren't aware of them, they don't have access, and then utilization of them is poor, And so when you think about what can be done, it's really, you have to be able to tap into some of these resources, some of these other things. So you just ask those simple questions of why are they on social media? Why do they have so much time to be on social media? What else could they be doing? You start asking those additional questions, and then you start saying, well, we're just pointing at this one thing, when life is so complex to say it's just this, right? You could tie it into diet, right? Because of the lack of nutrition that are in some of the food deserts in the community, some of those nutrients that would help with their production of serotonin and some of these other things that cause them to think clear and be able to be more attentive or focus more, causes them to not be as productive and now see themselves as a failure, right? And so that self-awareness, that esteem that we talked about earlier. So it's really more complex, but it can be done, right? When you start thinking about the resources that are out there and the different things that are strategically placed in communities, that if we could all come together to those points and redirect when needed to an additional resource, right? And that's where organizations like, I'll name drop, but Spalding and PAL and the churches really come together and play a vital role in the community. When you think about the concept of church, there's this PBS episode that's on right now, or last 2 days, and they talked about the richness of this church being this source for all these different resources, but the place where people got educated on, what are their interests, how do they get to these resources, and how do they find things as jobs and best schools and things like that. It really takes us going out and stepping beyond ourselves and believing that we do have to lean on other people other than just what we're equipped to do.
That brings up an important question, though. I mean, and I've had multiple discussions about the mental health system in this country over the course of my career. The stigma around mental health is still out there. It still creates problems, and it also creates problems in even getting funding for programs that we need to make sure that we're taking care of people. We don't want to talk about it so much that we underfund these things to the detriment of our society. I don't want to say that this is a silver lining in any way, shape, or form, but we are starting to pay attention a little bit to what is happening here. Is there anything positive that comes out of this uptick in what we're seeing, based on the fact that we are actually talking about it? Are there ways that we could strengthen the mental health system to deal specifically with these types of issues that are arising from what we've been discussing all night?
There's
and
a
silver
lot.
lining's the wrong way to put it.
So I think the word silver lining is triggering for some people, right? But there is something about the narrative in the world, not just the US, really talking a lot more about mental health and having conversations that is promising, right? The WHO had in their agenda mental health for the first time recently. That's impressive. And why wasn't there before? Right. And so I do think that it's incredible. Yeah, it's not enough, Craig. What we're seeing is that families are struggling, kids are struggling. We have this uptake on it, but it's not the first thing we're talking about. Right. So the first piece is like, how do we elevate so we minimize stigma? And then what do we do? And then we get to two major crises. One is, good care and then access to care. So can you access it? And sorry, I have a little one going to bed, so you might hear it. Can you access care, right? And can you access good care? And that to me means re-engineering an entire system, right? It's getting out of what we do and what we need to do in my brain, and I'm very biased here, we need to train paraprofessionals. We need to change clergy. We need to train everyone in basic principles of emotion regulation, right? Sometimes as parents, you're not doing the thing that is the best for your kid because you don't know it. And we're never going to have enough mental health professionals, right? We have, before COVID, 20% of the US population needed mental health care. 0.17% is trained to offer it. Now, we better re-engineer it, and it has to be at the system level.
April, then Robert.
Yes. And then Luana, isn't it true that also within that there is a dearth of mental health professionals for teens and tweens as well, right? Like the specialization, and then doctors, right? Like pediatricians are also having to deal with the mental health issue. So we also have a lack of a real professional lack in that area for teens and tweens, where it's urgent now, where there's not enough practitioners to meet the needs.
It's a huge gap, April, and one that gets even worse if you talk about any individual of color, right? It becomes impossible to see somebody like you. And so it is a national crisis if you think about it. We have teens coming up and saying, I'm suffering, very few people able to actually help them. And pediatricians are tapped. They don't have more than 15, 20 minutes, and they're screening for it, but they don't know what to do after.
Well, and Luana, follow up on that for just a second, because there'll be some people that'll comment on here. It'll say, well, why does it matter? As long as there's somebody to listen and try to help the people in the situation. But why is it so critical that they have somebody that looks like them that they're dealing with?
For many, many reasons. One, you're much more likely to actually pay attention, listen, and follow through if it is somebody like you. Two, we all have biases and we see the world very different. And so your assessment, being a person of color or another person of color, is likely to be much more accurate than not. And when it comes to things like racism and discrimination, it is really hard to talk to somebody that it looks very different than you. And so it's a matter of like trusting, understanding views of the world. And there are plenty of data that suggests that patients get better faster when they see people similar to them.
Yeah, and I'll speak to that briefly. So I spent about 15 years at Pfizer, and I was in psychiatry, and we would call on urgent care centers, for instance, in Detroit Medical Center, and I would also go in the suburbs. And what was interesting is that uh, patients that come in, African American patients that would go into the crisis center in some areas, would be seen as schizophrenic, right, or very aggravated and aggressive, versus they go to another area and they're looked at as bipolar, schizoaffective, right, meaning not as severe. And it was based off of, if I'm a person and culturally I may just be a louder person, right? I may communicate differently, and I may need to be calmed down from an agitation just because that's Uncle Joe. He just revs up and he's not really agitated to the point where he needs to be heavily sedated. He just needs to be talked to, right, in that way. So there is some things that speak to cultural awareness as well as just, understanding in that way. What was spoken to earlier that I love is just that you really have to speak to just the importance of communicating once again, right, and being able to clearly think through and listen without the intent of talking at people, but really seeking to kind of understand where they're coming from, to address some of the challenges.
Well, Luana, I want to just get a comment that came in from Flynn, who is one of our people, who said, I've been waiting for an opening in a mental health therapy for a foster child for 6 months now on 4 different agencies waiting lists. So that sort of gives people an idea of what people are dealing with. And that list could be, it could be even longer than that for many of these people.
And
go ahead, Robert.
Yeah, I got one other point. And so as community organizations, right, one of the things that we added in was just, we have to look at addressing socioeconomic health and wellness and educational needs, even as a sports organization, right? And so when we think about it, we added a component. We have a great model which looks at, goal setting, resilience, embracing healthy lifestyles, accountability, and teamwork. But that embracing healthy lifestyles, we've now added on mentor training that includes understanding of some of the mental health challenges, right? Because in sports, we see it a lot where all of a sudden you see a kid that's upset, and normally you're upset after a game when you lose. But then when you throw your helmet, you chase down another kid, you curse out a referee, you do some of these other things. Imagine if some of these coaches and even some of these other mentors are armed with understanding of, I don't have to diagnose it, but I can at least be aware of it to the point where I can bring it to the attention of that parent. And then because we're aligned with these other community organizations, we can then align with someone that can become a part of those organizations, that now when they see them, they can now go right to a community mental health center of knowing that nurse or knowing a social worker who's already connected to the community. If we don't start doing those things, we're still going to have the same challenges. And until, we're not going to have the time to wait for this whole system to change. We have to come up with some of those solutions where we sit and how we sit. And so you have to, as a community organization nowadays, be willing to, jump into those things and partner with people that can help to equip people for those things.
Can I jump in for a second? Robert,
please.
I love what you just said. And so, and the time is now, we can't wait. And for many youth, it's a matter of life and death, right? And so about 7 years ago, I partnered with a nonprofit organization here working with young men coming out of jail and prison, and really at the highest risk. And what we did is we created a very flexible CBT model where the youth workers who were on the streets with them could deliver just basic dosages of emotion regulation. And we showed that they stayed in the program 70% more and 240% more likely to get a job. And these were youth workers who were gang involved themselves before. And so think about this. Imagine if we take this upstream and we teach teachers how to do this. Right? Every community organization has to have an aspect. We have to talk about emotional health. It doesn't have to be mental health. Maybe we can talk about brain health. We all have a brain and it needs to be exercised.
All right. Well, we've only got about 10, 15 minutes left here in the time that we have for this. And I want to get to this because I've had a number of questions that have come in on this. And sort of that balance between a kid's right to privacy and a parent's need and desire to protect their kids, and finding that balance and the tension that exists there and navigating that tension, because like I said, it's already difficult enough to deal with as a teenager. I can't imagine, it's not being a foster parent, I can't imagine what it's like to try to deal with somebody else's teenager in creating rules and things like that. But there have been a number of questions about, like, how do we deal with this tension? What's the best way to address it? I'm not sure I have the answer. That's why you guys are here. Who wants to tackle this one first? Because it is definitely something that a lot of people are struggling with.
Privacy is a big deal, right? It's a big deal. I mean, just in generally speaking, right? Like what is acceptable to be talking about inside and outside of our family, right? So it goes back to what is the way in which you are organized as a family, right? And what makes sense for you to be sharing externally. And also to be clear, like, this is new, right? This idea of it being on blast is new. Now, privacy in a family isn't new, and we're designed more so as a society. My family is my business, right? Like and to almost to a detriment to family, because we weren't talking about family enough. We weren't talking about family structure enough. We weren't talking about what we need as families. So now we've like kind of come so far away from that idea where family privacy is still really important. And yet everybody, mom, dad, caregiver, parent, whomever, grown up, we're putting things out ourselves. And then we're also including pictures of our kids, right? So it's a very confusing landscape when it comes to especially helping a young person into the teens and tween time, when you have some parents like putting a lot out there, right? But then saying that you can't do the same thing, right? And then the added layer with foster care and adoption is, what is really safe for, connection to extended family members. And then on top of that, even there's, especially when in this, we could have a whole nother debate about this, but the ancestry and the 23andMe privacy elements, right? It's now become a pastime to, do your genealogy for $99. Now, that's also a privilege to have the $99 to be able to do that. Okay, I get that. What has been transformational for some youth in foster care that I've worked with is, with all the right privacies in place, doing that genetic research to find out what you are, because you don't know. Right. So there's these many different layers of why privacy is important, what you're activating in service of that, right? And then what to be true for these platforms that you are existing within, on what the rules of privacy are on the back end of this. So it's intricate and it's difficult, but it's all for conversation too, talking about that with your child, with your extended family members, and then doing and then modeling what's appropriate behavior in social media, so that there's something to look at and refer to, say, this is what I do as a grown-up, this is what is appropriate. It's a lot. It's a whole nother webinar.
Yeah, well, right. And we could go ahead, Robert. You wanted to add something to that one?
Yeah, I was just going back to mutual purpose, mutual goals / mutual respect. But then there's some nuances in social media where some of those responsibilities of what the youth does goes back to the parent in some ways. And so I think really making some of those things clear, and to saying, when someone, once again, realizes you have their best interests, they may not like the answer or like, what's taking place. But then there is also, there's the adult, and then there's the youth, right? And so I think there are still boundaries and respect factors that are there, because, in some households it was like, that's just not happen. There's not a lot of discussion that's taking place. And in some, there's the ultimate dialogue, but at some point, someone has to make a decision to say, here's the best thing, and I think it really comes back to, that individual parents understanding of how important their role is and how important it is to set boundaries. I always go back to now, which is relevant to me, is I got a 4-year-old. If it was up to him, he'd be jumping through things. He'd stay up all night. He'd be drinking soda pop straight, not watered down. And
That's mean, Robert.
it'd be chaos. And I may even enjoy that chaos, right? Watching him run around like that. But unfortunately, he would hurt himself. He would harm himself. And like I said earlier, sugar honey iced tea would be hitting the fan, and I would be deep in it with him, right? And so I just think you have to be willing and courageous to do what's right, even when it's not something that is seen as understood or favorable at that moment. You know, I just think that's the part of parenting. That's the part of accountability of being a leader, you know, and I think that's just critical when it comes to those things.
You know, Luana, though, I mean, this gets to that question, though, of trust. And, you know, you want your kids to believe that you trust them, but there are so many opportunities to show that you don't necessarily trust them every single day, especially when it comes to social media. And it's out of concern. It's out of worry most of the time that our kids are potentially in harm's way. Especially if you're worried about them being bullied or something like that, or somebody's harassing them online, because this does happen. But there's got to be that fine line somewhere that we don't cross. And how do you figure that out?
So I'd urge us to think about trust slightly different than I trust you, yes or no, but in which domain I trust you and how much I trust you. And I don't think we talk about that enough in our society, right? I bet you all would trust me with $5, but if I asked you to lend me $1 million, you might be hesitant. We just met in a webinar, right? But you trusted that I'd show up on time. And so there's domains of trust, and you can really trust your kid a lot in a lot of things, treat their vegetables and their ice cream for that matter. But, you know, in social media, they gain your trust and they work towards that trust. And there are moments that trust is violated and you talk about it. What is the consequence of doing this versus that? But I wouldn't categorize on trust and not trust. It's sort of like when you're upset at your 3-year-old or 4-year-old for that matter, Robert, right? You love them, but you're still upset with them. And both things can be true. And so you can trust them mostly, but they're domains. And I think if we flex our thinking around trust, then perhaps it's easier to talk about it and work around them.
I want to get to this question, and I think April may have an answer to this one, but I thought this was pretty good. We have one of the people that said, look, I'm not on social media at all. I'm on Facebook only. Is there sort of a social media for dummies out there so I can understand what platforms my kids are on, how they work, why they're there, what kinds of things happen on them, without actually having to join all these myself to figure it out? Is there sort of like a guide that's out there for people to understand? Because, you know, TikTok came out of nowhere, right? As did Snapchat, as did Twitter eventually. I mean, all these things came from somewhere, and there's just another platform that springs up just about every other week, it seems.
Yeah, you know, I would do a couple things. One, I would search for social media for dummies for teens. Like, there's probably a book. I don't know that book, but I'm sure it exists, and you'll find articles. And
write it.
Yeah, right, there you go. But I would also like talk to some younger adults. Like I mean, you could read something, you can listen to a podcast. Go and find a trusted young adult who is responsible, that you know, that you trust, and have them take you through some of these social media platforms. You don't have to have them yourself, but to have the phone in your hand and to click on something and to look at it, to watch a TikTok. I mean, you know, I think like seeing and doing and experiencing is much better than any book you can read. That said, doing some research on what the privacy policies are, right? And look at what is, like, for the best you can do, because the information is only as good as the people who are running these platforms want you to know. But I think it's a both and. But I would say, even if there is the perfect book out there, there's nothing better than sitting with someone with that phone in your hand, playing around, clicking on things. I also think that, you know, part of me would encourage you on some level, right? Especially if you have a teen that's in it, is to maybe try some of these platforms. I know that that's counter to what a lot of parents might feel and think, but there was some like Luana said, there's some amazing TikTok content out there. like amazing, right? That is really, really helping people. So, you know, I think experiencing it is the best way you can learn what this might mean to your kid. Have them show you. Have them show you.
Can you, as a parent in this day and age, afford to not be aware of these platforms? Because a lot of people pride themselves on being social media illiterate. They're like, I don't bother with that nonsense. I don't want to be involved, because it is, for a lot of people, something that's foreign to them. But Luana, you're shaking your head like we don't have that luxury, do we?
We don't. I mean, it's impossible, right? If you really look at it, your kid's trajectory of their life is going to have this more and more and more. And you putting blinders on, it's sort of like your kid comes home completely drunk, was driving, you're like, oh, it's okay. We can't do that. Like, we have to have some understanding of what you can and can't do. And I'm with April. You don't have to be active on them, but you have to at least understand what they look like, sit and experience. And I personally wouldn't want my kid on something that I didn't even see ever, right? I would want to have a taste of it and understand it, so that you can have the tough conversations that April and Robert are talking about, sort of what is appropriate here versus not, right? And how do you stay engaged in a way that's psychologically healthy?
Yeah, and then once again, it's layers, right? You may have a niece or a nephew that can help you, understand it and use them as a guide to be able to help you through it and even help to guide them in those discussions. Sometimes we think, once again, we're the one that has to be the ultimate communicator. We just have to be resourceful in understanding, if I'm not coming across in a clear way, I'm going to try to find someone else, because ultimately I want what's best, for them at that time. At some point, when you're raising anybody or you're communicating with anybody, you start to talk at them versus having real dialogue. And so I think it is time to, ultimately be looking for other people and mentors sometimes that you respect and know that are aligned, the way you would hope they would be aligned to do that.
All right, well, we've got just a couple of minutes left, and I want to get to this question, which came in from Melissa, who said, and this could be a good way to wrap this up. How do we teach our kids and teens that what they see on social media isn't always real? Just because they see it on YouTube doesn't mean it's real, but how do we teach this other than saying you can't believe everything you see? I mean, media literacy, fake news, this is something I deal with all the time. It extends to social media as well, obviously. Giving them the message that they need to be skeptical of the things that they see. How do we do that?
I'll start. I just think it's important that we just teach, our youth critical thinking skills. And you teach those skills by the questions that you ask them, right? It's like anything. If you watch CNN or you watch Fox News, they're going to give you what they want you to believe and want you to think. And now it comes back to, do you regurgitate what they're saying? I'll talk to my dad sometimes after knowing that he's listened to 97.1 The Ticket, right? And most of the time he has a viewpoint of one of the announcers that were on there, the broadcasters that are speaking. And then I'll ask him, well, what does he think about it? And it changes and shifts the whole conversation, right? Because it causes him to think through what he really believes about what the team is doing. He's talking about the Pistons and what he believes the next move should be, in regards to building a good team. And it's the same thing with our youth. It's you have to be able to stop and have that dialogue to say, you saw just what I saw. What do you think? And why do you think that? What would you do if you were in control? So it's those things. And then you have to be able to help them to relearn, because sometimes even you or someone else can give them misinformation, even with your best intent, right? And so you have to be open to say, I was wrong. I gave you this information and it was wrong. The sky was actually purple. It wasn't directly blue, right? And so I think we just have to be willing to unlearn, but also to ask those questions to get and find out, what do they really think for themselves, versus a lot of times what they are regurgitating from what they heard from someone else.
Yeah, well, it's hard for me not to be cynical about this thing, but critical thinking is not our nation's strong suit. But Luana or April, I'm going to give you guys the last word on this if you want to talk about that, helping kids understand that what they see is not necessarily real. Before I turn it over to Christina in just a second.
So I was actually going to echo what Robert said. We teach them how to think, slow their brain down, but also understand how they're thinking. What are the conclusions? How are they arriving there, right? And their brain makes sense. And, it's surprising. I spend a ton of my time teaching people that thoughts are not facts, that what you're saying to yourself is not a fact. And it's surprising. So teaching to have alternative views and understanding what may be more likely is important.
All right. And April, you got 30 seconds.
Hey, you know what? I think Robert and Luana just completely covered it. And I just want to, again, just double down on the love for parents navigating life today, because it is not easy. And that's all, just a message of love, and love isn't one dimensional, right? So just keep doing what you're doing. And yeah.
Well, that is the perfect way to end this, I think. That's always the way to end everything, right? April Dinwiddie, thank you so much. Luana Marques, thank you. And Robert Jamerson, we really, really appreciate it. And I turn things back over to Christina. That was a fun conversation. Thank you, everybody.
Thanks, Craig. Thanks,
Christina.
so much.
Wow. Thank you so much for joining us tonight. I hope you have found that a very interesting conversation as helpful as we did here. Thank you so much for your participation as well as for the great questions. I mean, they're really wonderful questions. I wish we could have answered all the questions that were posted. But I also would like to know that we're going to be sending you the link of the recording of this conversation today. We're also going to be sending you a certificate of attendance and a list of resources. April mentioned several of the resources that are available to parents. We're going to be sending you a list of that. And we hope also that you're going to be able to answer a survey that was going to be sent to the participants. So this way it can help us to design our next webinar, because I have the feeling they're going to have a follow-up to this conversation, because it's very rich and there's so much to be covered. We're also going to be there are so many questions came up that we're going to be able to send to you some of the questions with some answers to the questions. So in a way that we're not losing the really critical issues that the families and the participants are bring to our attention. So I just want to thank again Craig Fowler for a terrific job. Thank our panelists, Luana Marques and Robert Jamerson and April Dinwiddie. You guys did a fantastic job. And thank our partners, the Detroit PAL, the Life Church of Auburn Hills, Melissa and Frank Bunker at Campbell Marketing. And thank you, very special thank you to our sponsor, the Health Alliance Plan of Michigan. And so again, thank you everyone for being part of this conversation, and we hope to get together very soon again for a continuation of this conversation. So stay tuned. So thank you so much for being here tonight with us, and all the best to you, and best of luck with your families and your children. Thank you.
Good night.
Good night.
Night.
Thanks.